Shabbat Shalom. So we thought that this morning we'd do something a little bit different considering the events of last week. And first and foremost, we felt that it was important for the three of us, Debbie as the president of the synagogue and for Rabbi Friar Bodzin and me as the rabbis of the synagogue, to be together and to stand together on the Shabbat as a way of responding in our own way to what happened last week, that the synagogue is still important, that the community is still important, and that though there's always reason to be concerned, and last week was another reminder of how real those reasons are, still we have to make a statement that we're prepared to continue to be here, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and so forth. And so we thought that the message this week is really conversation between the three of us about how we interpreted, experience, reflect, and find hope and confidence in the future as a result of the events that happened in Colleyville last Shabbat. And that's really, the format for this morning is a conversation between the three of us. And Debbie's going to kind of function as our moderator and to start us off. Okay, so all right, I should stick to the script that I myself wrote. Let's start, Debbie, with you. When you heard the news about what was going on in Colleyville, as an active member of a Jewish community, but also as the president of a synagogue, what was going through your mind at that moment?
Okay, so you all know I'm not a rabbi, so I wrote it down because I wanted to get what I wanted to say straight. Sorry. I'm normally way loud enough. First of all, my thoughts were for the hostages and praying that it would end peacefully. I've dealt with anxiety my entire life, so events like this can be triggering, so I felt fear. Right into the mic, sorry. So I'll admit that I felt scared at first, which soon turned to worry for others, as unfortunately we know that this isn't an isolated event. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. We as Jews know and live this. And when there is an anti-Semitic attack, hate targeting other racial groups increases. So I worried for others. And then I felt anger. Anger that we live in a world that my kids have had to grow up learning how to stay safe in a lockdown situation, literally since kindergarten. And frankly, anger towards law enforcement and political leaders who will not call this what it was, anti-Semitism. Hate, systemic hate that is based on race. A person does not walk into a synagogue, a mosque, or a Baptist church with a firearm for any other reason other than they have been taught to hate, and in this case, anti-Semitic tropes, and they mean to do harm. I remember the first year that we printed an evacuation plan at Beth Tzedec that was at every seat on the High Holy Days. I actually took that sheet to work to show people what it's like for Jews to attend synagogue on the holiest days of the year. It is a privilege to go to a house of worship and not have to worry about where the safe place is to meet your children after a shooting, to not have to have your Clay Kodesh and staff have hostage and lockdown training. As my sister wrote to me on Thursday, the fact that agents and news outlets, are ignoring the systemic piece of this after almost 2 years of social uprising, educating people on systemic issues is frankly so disheartening. So I was disheartened, but also emboldened to not remain silent. Rabbi Friar Bodzin, can you share how you felt?
Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, and Sunday, I was numb. I was traumatized. We went through the motions of putting together this vigil, and we knew the words to say, but I couldn't believe that we were actually doing it for the reason that we were. At one point, I said to a friend of mine, well, if there's a global pandemic, I guess this can happen too, in real life. We kept it from the youngest member of our family, who hopefully isn't understanding what we're talking about right now. I did all the things that I usually do to clear my head, and none of them worked. I went for a super long walk before the blizzard started. I even left the house and went to Yorkdale, hoping that would help, and I couldn't find parking, and I just got even more upset about it. And it wasn't until Monday, at about 2 o'clock, that I was able to get out of a really bad place. Most of you know that for a couple of years now, we've been teaching a perek, a chapter of Tanakh every day. And it just so happened that the chapter that I was teaching that day was from Psalms, Tehillim 140. Now, there's a lot of Psalms that we know really, really well, that are in our daily liturgy, that we use for happy occasions, but this one I'd never looked at before in depth. And here I was teaching it. I want to share a little bit of you. Chaltzeini Adonai me Adam ra, me ish hamasim tinsareni. Rescue me, God, from evil men. Save me from the lawless, whose minds are full of evil schemes, who plot war every day. Shomreini Adonai midei rasha, me ish hamasim tinsareni. God, keep me out of the clutches of the wicked. Save me from the lawless men who scheme to make them fall. Hashem Elokim Oz Yeshuati. God, you are the strength of my deliverance. You've protected me. Al titen Adonai me'avaye rasha. God, do not grant the desires of the wicked. Do not let their plans succeed, else they be exalted. Yadati ki ya'aseh Adonai din ani mishpat evyonim. I know that God will champion the cause of the poor and the right of the needy. And when I read that in order to teach it an hour later, I was suddenly a lot calmer, because I realized that our people have resilience, that we've been to these sorts of places before so many years ago that whether it was King David or one of his contemporaries, they wrote these words because there have been evil men. And he knows that God will champion our causes and that God doesn't grant the desires of the wicked. Psalm 140 was exactly what I needed to read on Monday, so I was able to function for the rest of the week and be a listening voice to so many who are still stuck with the trauma that we experienced. I believe in Beshert. It was absolutely Beshert that was the one that came to us on Monday. Reb Steve, how about you?
I had a variety of emotions when I heard the news. The first actually comes out of the fact that in my previous position as the CEO of USCJ, one of the jobs I had, or one of the opportunities I had, was to interface with the Department of Homeland Security of the Obama administration on a regular basis. And I remember the first time that JFNA, Jewish Federations of North America, brought together the leaders of all the Jewish movements in North America in order to start having those security briefings. And we had security briefings really 3 or 4 times a year, including with Juliette Kayyem, who's now an analyst for CNN, who was then the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. And I remember the first time I had that security briefing, I didn't sleep for 2 weeks because it scared the heebie-jeebies out of me in terms of what the threat level was against Jews, certainly in the United States. And that was more than 10 years ago already at this time when those briefings started to happen. And so my first reaction actually was curiosity, in the sense of that what happened last week was a hostage circumstance. And that's not really what, it's not what we expect in the Jewish community, for better or for worse, right? The expectation is that it's going to be an active shooting event, and that it's much different and different set of anxiety and worries and so forth. But my first reaction is like, maybe there's an opportunity that these hostages are actually going to survive, because I knew that hostage taking was different than what we've come to expect. And I also knew the statistic that more than 90% of hostage circumstances end favorably, with the hostages at least being released. So the first thing that came to my mind was a little bit of curiosity. What's different about this, and what is it that the perpetrator wants? The second thing that went through my mind was just like, I can't believe I'm even thinking about the first thing that's going on. That we live in a world where it's possible to, because of my training and my experience and the opportunities that I had, to be able to approach this circumstance from that way, because it's just like all that training, all those briefings just kicked in. And then the third thing was that this is going to end quickly, because hostage circumstances don't normally take as long as this one did. And that if I'm feeling disrupted, if you're feeling disrupted, we're all feeling disrupted, and that we needed to do something quickly to bring people together, to have that sense of being together. Because the thing that went through my mind, which went through all of our minds, is that for those of us that come to shul, and for those of us that are involved in the Jewish community, is that what happened there could happen anywhere.
Yep.
That's why we do the security stuff that we do here, and we've been doing that for more than a decade. And so therefore, we're all experiencing the same emotions, and what we need to do is come together to see each other, to hear each other, and to turn to our tradition, to Psalms primarily, and other prayers, in order to have this sense of we're all in this together and we'll get through it. We have a language to deal with it. And that turned out to be exactly what we needed. With an hour's notice, we had 150 people on a Zoom link for vigil, and we had there's been more than 1,000 people now that have viewed our vigil online on Facebook. So clearly, those three things went through my mind, and seemed to be what we needed in the moment.
It's actually very interesting that you bring up Juliet, because on CNN that day, she was the only one calling it an anti-Semitic act. She said from the very beginning, you don't go into a synagogue unless you mean to do Jews harm. So it's very...
it's important to know something about Juliet for that. She's an Arab American married to a Jewish person raising Jewish kids.
Amazing.
Right? So it's important to know that about her. So that background says something important about who she is and how she approaches these things. In fact, she wrote an article about the tension, that after Pittsburgh, she was asked by her synagogue to advise their newly formed security committee, which of course makes sense. She's one of the most well-known security experts in the world for these kinds of things. And what she went through it in she writes about going through this in the detached emotional way that you go through security things, that the object of security is to minimize risk and maximize defense. And so she went through her checklist of things, and then she got to the question, which actually Arnold, our security guard, asked me about this morning, which is the right one from the security perspective, is and you should have a way where everybody who comes into the building needs to show ID and identify themselves from where they're coming from, and so forth and so on. And that's the tension between being a place that is designed to be vulnerable, not in terms of necessarily security threats, but vulnerable in the sense of when we come to the sanctuary, we come to stand before God, the notion of the hitvadeya, of vidui on Yom Kippur, is the notion of exposing yourself, right? Of being naked and trembling and defenseless and vulnerable before God. This is supposed to be a place of vulnerability, and so we have that tension between vulnerability and welcoming.
Yeah.
Right? How do we defend ourselves and also keep our value of Abraham's tent where the doors are open on all four
Right.
sides.
Debbie, were there any prayers that came to you as this was unfolding?
Well, one, this is me personally. It has nothing to do with the events. The first one's what we just sang, Eitz Chaim. For whatever, first of all, I love harmony, and if anyone's standing next to me when I'm singing Eitz Chaim, I'm constantly harmonizing the entire time. And for whatever reason, that's when I feel my grandfather's presence during that prayer. The other one is Oziva Zimat Yah,
Sure.
which we read last week.
Mm-hmm.
And mainly because when Michael was saying Kaddish for his dad before COVID, when we read Daily Minyan, as I think Lauren called it the Daily Minyan of Blessed Memory yesterday at his Kiddush Club, when we came to those lines in Psuke, and for whatever it was the group that was saying Kaddish at that time, everybody would sing, and sing with passion and love and loud, really loudly. And for me, it's like a warm, inclusive hug, and that's what I needed. And it's about strength and resiliency, which we also need right now.
Absolutely.
Reb Steve?
So like Rabbi Friar Bodzin, the psalm that I taught on last Friday, or was it this Friday?
No, it was last Friday.
It was last Friday.
Yeah.
It was Psalm 144, 145, and it began with David. King David is reflecting after a victory, and now there's this moment of peace that he has after fighting to defend his kingdom. And the psalm begins with a prayer to God to strengthen his fingers and his hands and to teach him the ways of war. So it's interesting that, again, we have these juxtapositions, this tension within our tradition. For much of our tradition, when Jews were not in power, there was no question of how Jews defend themselves, really, because they didn't have the ability to do that. When you don't have the authority of a state to create police and judges and an army, there's no question of doing that. But I'm reading the psalm, and it reflects back to a time when, the first commonwealth, so to speak, of the Jewish people of the state of Israel, and the need to defend yourselves. But then at the same time, there's the balance of the use of power. And so when I was looking at that psalm, it just really spoke to me about what I was thinking about, which is the need to defend ourselves, the need to have reasonable security measures in place, but also that balance of the use of power and how do we maintain, as I said earlier, that sense of welcoming that we want synagogues and churches and mosques. I mean, that's what the sanctuary is supposed to be, a place of safety. It's supposed to be a place of safety. And how do we balance that? And that psalm, just on that day, same thing. I was teaching it, and the words just seemed eerily, basharatly relevant to what was happening in the world.
I think that's why the Psalms are timeless.
I think you're right, for sure. Rabbi Friar Bodzin, what from this week's Torah reading gives you a sense of comfort and of confidence and resiliency as we think about the future?
So everything about this week's Torah reading, it's just all miraculous. But I actually want to speak about something about last week's, from last week's Torah. There's a new, I'm a big podcast listener, and oftentimes I waste time listening to stuff that you don't think a rabbi should listen to, but I also listen to a lot of Torah. And I've started listening to a new podcast called Chutzpah. And it's with a rabbi, Rabbi Shira Stutman, who was at 6th and I in D.C. for many, many years, and Joshua Molina, who's an actor and grew up an observant guy. He said in this week's that he wakes up every morning and says Modeh Ani, and he goes to sleep every night and he says Shema. Sounds pretty legit to me. And he knows his stuff. And so they had 2 episodes, and then they had an extra episode, which I didn't get to until one of our members, Alan Caney, he sent Reb Steve and I a text or an email to listen to it. I think it was Tuesday, the day right after the storm. It was the day after the Psalm 140. And they had this extra podcast where they taught a little bit of Torah. So Rabbi Shira Stutman, she brought in this stunning Torah from Rabbi Alan Liu, Zichron Livracha, and he translated from last week chapter 14, verses 13 to 15, in a very particular way. And these are the verses where Moshe reassures the people after the first time they start to kvetch. They're like, what are you bringing us here? We're going to die. There's no food. The trope that we'll see throughout the book of Numbers. And this is how Rabbi Alan Liu translated these words. You asked about inspiration? This is it. But Moses said to the people, Al tira'u, don't be afraid. Hit yatzvu, collect yourselves. Ur'u, and see the salvation that Adonai will make for you today. Adonai will fight for you, and you will be still. Tacharishun. And then Adonai says to Moshe, why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites, vayisahu, get going. So what Rabbi Liu noticed, this is the chup, is that there were 5 verbs in these 3 verses. And Rabbi Stutman, building on Rabbi Liu, created a contemporary understanding for what happened last week on Shabbat and how we're all reacting to it. So, al tira'u, don't let your fear paralyze you so you cannot move. Hityatzvu, stand up, stand strong. Ur'u, see the fullness of God and the presence of God everywhere around you. Va'atem tacharishun, and you will be silent, is the translation. That in that most difficult moment, we couldn't put words to our terror. This is me now building on Rabbi Stutman on Rabbi, right? We had that moment of shock and numb and stunned, and sometimes silence in the immediacy is the only option. Because like so many others, I was just silenced in fear. But then there's the next part, which is the most important. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, God says to Moshe, Daber el bnei Israel, say to the Israelites, Vayisa'u, go forward. This is the option that we have as the Jewish people, as a people of faith. And that is that at a certain point, we can't remain paralyzed, that we must go forward. And all of you that are in shul this morning, that's what you're doing. All of you who are watching at home as opposed to doing that's what you're doing. We can be mourned, and we can be scared, and we can be angry, and we can be traumatized for a moment. And that moment's going to be different for all of us. But then we need to be able to move forward, and that's what we're doing right now. B'Shem Rabbi Alan Liu. And you, Rabbi Steve?
Me first. So even though this is the parsha that we get the 10th, sorry. It's very hard with a mask. Even though this is the parsha where Bnei Israel received the 10 Commandments, it's Moshe's interaction with Yitro that I always focus on. I also wrote this because I'm not a rabbi. So Moshe is considered the greatest leader the Jewish people have ever had. And yet, it's his father-in-law, a Gentile, who teaches him what he needs to do, and more importantly, what he needs to change in order to become that great leader. So I'm the grandchild of a convert. My grandmother's family, so 1/4 of my family is not Jewish. My grandmother's family was and is filled with wise, wonderful people who have added to my life in such positive ways. There is so much to learn from the other. It is because we were once slaves in Egypt that the Torah tells us multiple times that it is our duty to care and respect the other. So the Parsha ultimately leaves me with hope that leaders and people of all faiths can learn from one another and truly work together to make the world a better place.
Well, I didn't think this was going to happen, but Debbie, you and I focused on the same thing.
Whoa. Good thing I went to last week.
Yeah. It's fascinating about Yitro. Not only is he a Gentile, but he's a Midianite priest. So he's a leader of his people. He was already at Har Sinai when Moshe was running away from Egypt and found Zipporah and her sisters at the well. So he was already worshiping this God on that mountain. And when Moshe comes back, Yitro greets him, they kiss, they hug, and Yitro had already heard about the things that God had done for Bnei Israel in Egypt and getting to that point. And then it's fascinating, as you said, he's the one who gives Moshe the advice on how to set up the judiciary. He says, you're doing this all wrong. The justice system has to be of the people and from the people, and you've got to delegate the authority. You can't do this by yourself, is the message that Yitro gives Moshe, and Moshe, of course, listens to it. And that's just, all those things just make Yitro fascinating. The Parsha that contains the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, is named for a Midianite priest.
I was going to say that, but I
Right?
didn't.
No, but you did. I mean, you know, I'm just saying what you're implying, right? Which we all know when we look at it. This Parsha is named for a Midianite priest. We remember thousands of years later Yitro's name and the contribution that he played to Moshe Rabbeinu and to the Jewish people. And I think it's a stark reminder. I mean, Juliet in some ways is related to that. It's a stark reminder that we need allies. We can't defend ourselves in a bubble. We can't just build a fortress. We have to engage in the larger world. We need allies. We need allies in leadership and in government, in law enforcement, and in the community. And so I was really moved by the members of the Muslim and Christian community that reached out to me after this to express their support, and the call that the Muslim leaders made for there to be some sort of national summit of faith leaders to talk about the phobias, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and violence, and how we stand together shoulder to shoulder to combat this. That was really moving to me.
I was really moved by a letter that I saw in many places on social media from the Orthodox Union,
RCA.
the RCA, that they wrote a letter to Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker saying that they're with him. And they ended it with a few words in Hebrew, Achenu Kol Beit Israel, which means we're all here together in many, many ways. And that made me pause. That brought the tears back for a little while.
And that prayer is how we're going to end right now before we go on with Musaf. Achenu Kol Beit Israel comes from the morning Shachrit service on the weekdays. It's a prayer that says that all of us are, all of Israel are like family. We pray that God will redeem us, that God will protect us and defend us. And though theologically in the old world it was literally for God to do that, more modern theology is that it's a partnership, that God will inspire us to balance these mitzvot that we have to do. And so, Cantor?
The people at home, I think, will be able to see the words on the screen. But,
yes, that's true.
You'll get it at home for the translation.
There's an advantage for those that are watching today. Go ahead, Cantor.
Achenu Kol Beit Israel, Achenu Kol Beit Israel, Anetuni b'tzara u'b'shivya, ha'omdim ben bayam u'ben bayabasha. Achenu Kol Beit Israel, Achenu kol Beit Yisrael, הנתונים בצרה, בצרה ובשביה, העומדים בין בים ובין ביבשה. המקום ירחם, ירחם עליהם ויוציאי מצרה, לרווחה ומאבלה לאורה, ומשיבוד לגאולה השתה, בגלה ובזמן קריב. המקום ירחם, ירחם עליהם ויוציאם מצרה, לרווחה ומאבלה לאורה, ומשיבוד לגאולה השתה, בגלה ובזמן קריב.
Turn now to Musaf, page 155. In our Siddurim, we rise for Chatzi Kaddish.